This episode contains content that may be inappropriate for some viewers. I want you to take a second right now and just try to think of a core memory of yours. Most memorable events start a little something like this. So, grade 7, I showed an aptitude for the clarinet. Then, the reason that we so often share memories in the form of stories is because we store them as stories. A few years ago, I was sitting with a group of 20-something grade 6 students, and it was a Monday morning, and we were doing a morning meeting where all of the students shared what they had done on their previous weekend. And the class was rowdy. They were loud, there were side conversations, there were bouts of unrelated screaming, as there is in grade 6, and just general tweenage shenanigans. If you've ever stepped inside a middle school, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I was barely holding on to the control of the room when one of the students cut through all of the noise and shared something about his weekend. 3 words. My mom died. The room fell completely silent. It was the first moment in that entire school year that there was true silence. And this complete silence was something I hadn't experienced beforehand with this group, and it never happened after that either. Now, later, I did clarify with this student that he did not, in fact, lose his mother. He lost someone that his mom was close to, and while he was caught up in his sadness, he misspoke in our meeting. But no one at the time, including myself, knew that. I was so struck and continue to be so struck by this moment, and over time I've come to the conclusion that it was impactful because it was about salience. The high priority signals in human evolution of social loss, attachment rupture, and mortality lit up the brains of every single person in the room. The room didn't become calm because I commanded it to become calm. It became synchronized because every single brain judged the signal as urgent and meaningful. And that right there is the key. It wasn't the length, it was stakes. Here's the important part. You cannot and should not try to induce trauma-level salience to manufacture attention. That intensity came from perceived loss. And you don't replicate that by escalating drama. You replicate the mechanism that's underneath it. And what was the mechanism at play in that moment? To be completely honest with you, I was struggling with this specific group of students. Their attention was constantly fleeting, and it felt like a regular battle to present them with content that would hold their attention beyond the 10-second mark. And somehow, every single person in that room had reacted to a salient moment in unison. How was that possible? I found myself asking, if everything we experience as humans is processed, encoded, and recalled as a narrative, how can I create narrative stakes regularly without harm? When that boy spoke his 3-word story, the room experienced something that neuroscientists call prediction error. The brain was predicting a rowdy morning meeting, but instead it received maternal death. The power wasn't in the tragedy, the power was in the broken expectations. Up here, expressing loss reorders the room. Everyone's nervous system checks. What's the appropriate response? How do I belong in this moment right now? These students were capable of profound regulation. The nervous systems that looked chaotic minutes beforehand demonstrated immediate synchrony when meaning appeared. And while I was struggling to harness the attention of this group throughout that school year, I was also very lucky because they were incredibly emotionally literate. And they were able to rally and support this student through that grief. And this day, this story will stick with me for as long as I live because of how profoundly it affected the entire class with 3 simple words. Now, you can't fake grief, but you can create moments where people feel like something important is unfolding, and the ethical version of this narrative is tension without harm. Mystery without drama, surprise without destabilization. You get where I'm going with this. So the move here is not escalation. I cannot stress this enough. I went back and forth on sharing this story so many times. Forgive me for sounding like a broken record. We need to focus on intentional architecture of the narrative. And you can build this by inviting people into something unfolding versus presenting something that has already come to a conclusion. Our brains crave significance, and that morning I saw firsthand what happens when significance enters the room. And I'm sharing this story here because it is something to understand and not something to replicate. Okay, that's the last time I'm gonna say that. We don't wake up in the morning asking for information. We wake up in the morning looking for meaning. The paradox here is that information is cheap, it's readily available, and meaning is difficult to find. It's metabolically expensive, and the brain is extremely selective about what it lets in because of this. When we're listening to a story, multiple neural networks light up simultaneously. In some cases, the listener's brain activity literally synchronizes with the storyteller's brain activity, a phenomenon called neural coupling. In other words, explanation informs, but story recruits. And that difference is incredibly important in a classroom setting. When we present isolated facts, we're asking people's working memory to hold on to abstract symbols long enough to encode them. But as we've discussed so far in this series, working memory is limited and holds maybe 4 chunks at once. And that's not a lot of bandwidth. Stories, however, compress information into structure, and the hippocampus is central to this memory consolidation. It organizes experiences into sequences or stories. Narratives mirror how episodic memory already works in our brains. That's why we're able to remember what happened at a party a decade ago, but we're unable to remember the specific amount of flour that goes into a bread recipe that we've made every weekend for a decade. Because the brain evolved to track agents, motives, threats, alliances. Long before we had PowerPoints, we had campfire stories, which means that when we are teaching through only explanations, we are working against our brain's architecture. And this episode is all about leveraging that architecture through story. In chapter 1, we're going to unpack why stories organize memory differently and how narrative structure reduces the cognitive load and increases retention. In chapter 2, we're going to explore humor as a cognitive disruption because jokes are, at their core, prediction violations, and boy, do our brains love a violated prediction. In chapter 3, we're going to look at how emotion tags memory, why embarrassment, delight, surprise, and even mild absurdity increases consolidation through amygdala hippocampal interaction. And in the conclusion, I will make my case for the slightly controversial argument that jokes often teach better than explanations because they align with how the nervous systems actually encode meaning. Our brains don't store facts like a filing cabinet, they organize experiences like the plot of a movie. So if we want learning to last, we have to teach in a way that mirrors how memory actually works. Through stories. Let's get into it. Detox starts now. Chapter 1. Why stories organize memory. It's easy to think that our memories are designed to archive information, and while that is somewhat true, it is more aptly designed to encode experiences. Cognitive psychology distinguishes between semantic memory, which is all of the things not attached to context, and episodic memory, and these are lived time-bound experiences. Semantic memory stores that Paris is the capital of France, but episodic memory stores, I got that question wrong on a quiz in grade 6 and I felt embarrassed. The latter is richer, more relational, and more durable because it is embedded in the context of a story. The hippocampus binds separate elements like people, locations, and emotions into coherent representations, and this process is called relational binding. Without it, our memory fragments, and with it, it forms a network. In other words, memories embedded with an episodic structure are more easily recalled because of all of the different neural connections between the different elements of that story. It would be like the difference between trying to find a needle in a haystack versus trying to find a needle in a haystack attached to a fishing line. The stories provide the pre-bound information that make up the fishing line, meaning that you don't have to find the outcome of the story or the needle itself. You only have to find something that is attached to the outcome of that story or the fishing line in order to wind your way to the conclusion of the story. When we teach through narrative, we're not asking the hippocampus to assemble unrelated fragments after the fact. We're delivering them already organized into a relational scaffold, and the brain has a limited amount of processing capacity, so arranging the lessons we give to our students in a structured story eliminates the brain's need to weave them together into a coherent sequence before attempting to encode them to free up working memory. And in this way, narratives reduce extraneous load by embedding information within that causal structure. So instead of remembering fact A, fact B, and fact C independently, learners encode that A caused B, which led to C, and causality compresses complexity. Love alliteration, and it transforms multiple elements into one schema or scaffold, or just idea about how something works. Schema formation here is really the key. Once that exists, new information attaches more easily. Story accelerates schema production because it explicitly maps relationships rather than leaving them implicit. And there is another layer here, temporal sequencing. Research on time cells in the hippocampus demonstrates that neurons fire in ordered sequences that track unfolding events, meaning that memory is inherently sequential, and stories, by definition, unfold over time. Definitions do not. Definitions are static, stories are dynamic, and dynamic input maps more naturally onto the processing of our hippocampus. Now we can layer in predictive processing, because according to predictive coding models, the brain is constantly generating expectations and updating them when a prediction error occurs. Narratives inherently generate forward models. So once a story begins, the brain is busy predicting potential outcomes, and that anticipatory processing increases somebody's attention because unresolved predictions demand attention. This is sometimes called the Zeigarnik effect, which is the tendency to remember incomplete or interrupted tasks better than completed ones. Narrative tension exploits this bias because an unfinished arc lingers in our working memories, which is why cliffhangers work. It's just our cognitive architecture. When participants listen to stories, activation extends beyond just language processing models and into our sensory cortex, motor regions, and emotion-related structures. And going back to neural coupling from my introduction, some stories create synchronization between the speaker and the listener's brain activity. Synchronization is important here because when neural patterns align, comprehension increases. The learner is not passively decoding symbols, they are reconstructing the narrative state. This distributed encoding strengthens neural retrieval because memories stored across multiple systems have more retrieval queues. Again, the fishing line. A fact encoded only linguistically in our minds has fewer access points than an event encoded linguistically, emotionally, temporally, and socially. There's also evolutionary plausibility here because before literacy, knowledge transmission depended on oral storytelling, survival relevant information like where the predators were, which plants were poisonous, who betrayed who. All of these things were embedded into narratives. So the brain systems that evolved to track social information and threat detection became the infrastructure for memory organization, which means that our brains did not evolve for bullet points. They evolved for the plot. Do it for the plot. I ain't gonna do it. Now, return to the classroom moment that I started off this episode with. 3 words triggered narrative construction. The brains of the students in that class did not hear simple information. They simulated a scenario in their minds, and this came with loss, grief, social response. The brain fills in all of the missing details, and there were a lot of missing details because narrative scaffolding demands completion. And that is the power of the structure of our brains. Stories organize memory because they align with the hippocampal relational binding, reduce extraneous cognitive load, exploit predictive processing, leverage incomplete task bias, recruit distributed neural networks, and activate social cognition systems simultaneously. So, stories are not just about simple entertainment, but an alignment with our architecture. When instruction lacks structure, the brain has to work harder to impose one. But when instruction contains structure, the brain can use its limited resources to elaborate instead of assemble. Now, we are going to examine what happens when structure is interrupted through humor because, surprisingly, humor may be one of our most efficient memory enhancers. Chapter 2. Humor as cognitive disruption. If stories organize memory through structure, then humor strengthens it through violation. Jokes work because they break a prediction, and this is why the best jokes, not that dissimilar to magic, involve misdirection. The brain is constantly forecasting what comes next in the name of metabolic efficiency. The brain minimizes surprise by generating expectations and updating them when error occurs. And most of the time, those predictions are correct, and it keeps our brains and mental states stable. Humor, however, introduces a controlled error. You're led down one interpretive path, and then at the punchline, the meaning flips. The setup of the joke creates the cognitive frame, and the punchline violates it. And that violation is very precise. Incongruity theory of humor proposes that laughter arises when there is a mismatch between expectation and outcome, followed by rapid resolution. The brain detects inconsistency and then resolves it, and that resolution produces a reward. And the key here is that the resolution comes very quickly, not long enough for things to become uncomfortable. Humor activates reward-related regions, including the ventral striatum and the dopaminergic pathways. So dopamine is not only a pleasure chemical in this sense, it signals learning because it tells the brain, hey, update your model. So, in short, when a joke lands, the brain is forced to recalibrate, and that recalibration enhances encoding. There's also evidence that shows that humor improves retention. Studies show that humor tied to instructional material increases recall and engagement compared to other neural presentation tactics. The key word here is relevant because random distraction does not help, but disruption embedded within the concept creates cognitive tagging because surprise reallocates attention. The locus coeruleus norepinephrine system is central to arousal and attentional shifts and responds to unexpected stimuli. Good for you for hanging on after that really complicated sentence. All it means is that moderate novelty increases alertness and memory consolidation, and too much novelty overwhelms, too little increases boredom, and humor is right in that middle sweet spot, a safe violation. Safe here being the important word. In the classroom story I told in the beginning of this episode, the violation was too intense. The nervous system snapped to attention because the stakes were existential, and humor operates on the same mechanism, but at a much lower amplitude. It disrupts prediction without destabilizing safety, and that is why it works. There's another cognitive layer here of frame shifting. Many jokes require the listener to reinterpret earlier information once the punchline arrives, and that reinterpretation requires cognitive flexibility, which is our ability to update mental representations. And cognitive flexibility is a component of executive function associated with our prefrontal cortex. This is important because humor exercises the same neural systems required for conceptual change. Conceptual change is important because the restructuring of incomplete or incorrect mental models is central to learning. That's all that learning is. If somebody holds a misconception, simply stating the correct fact often does nothing. But if you introduce a scenario that exposes the flaw in an existing model, especially through absurd exaggeration, the brain experiences a manageable prediction error, and humor can act as this conceptual wedge. There's also emotional tagging at play here. Even mild positive affect enhances consolidation through amygdala hippocampal interactions. Laughter releases tension. It creates social bonding. Social bonding increases perceived safety. Safety increases cognitive openness. All of these concepts work together to build upon each other to synchronize a room of people, which is a requirement for learning to actually happen. So when a class laughs together, there is collective regulation. Shared affect reduces a social threat, which is especially important for adolescent brains because they are highly sensitive to peer evaluation. So lower social threat frees cognitive resources. So to wrap up this chapter, humor does many things simultaneously. It violates your prediction, it reallocates attention, it releases dopamine, it exercises cognitive flexibility, it strengthens emotional tagging, and it increases social cohesion. Talk about multi-system engagement. The paradox here is that a lot of educators who teach with these concepts in mind, either explicitly or implicitly, often do not appear to have the character traits that we associate with serious educators. Done right, this teaching looks effortless because anything less would require cognitive resources from the learners to decode, which takes away from their learning. These concepts require an incredibly detailed understanding of the human brain and can easily be dismissed as silly, funny, quirky teacher for some reason all of the students love. But it's not just some reason anymore. After this chapter, you know that that reason is based off of the architecture of our 21st century brains. Now, we're going to go beneath the structure and the disruption because there lies an amplifier that makes memory durable: emotion. Chapter 3: Emotions Tag Memory. So far in this episode, we've explored how narratives give shape to experience, and now we're going to talk about how emotion gives weight to experiences. The truth of the matter is that facts without feelings are often forgotten, and emotional laden memories stick better in our memories. Decades of research demonstrate that emotional arousal alters the way that memories are encoded, consolidated, and then later retrieved. The amygdala, which is associated with threat detection and affective processing, modulates the function of our hippocampus, which is the structure that is responsible for binding experiences into our long-term memories. So when the amygdala is engaged, the hippocampus prioritizes. Importantly, before we really get into this, emotion doesn't uniformly strengthen all memories. Instead, it acts like a tagging mechanism. This is why some of us might remember where we were when the second plane hit the towers. This happens because emotional arousing experiences trigger the release of stress hormones like epinephrine and cortisol, which in turn activates the amygdala, and that activation increases dopamine release in our mesolimbic circuits, which are involved in reward and motivation. And that cascade of hormones enhances consolidation in the hippocampus. The brain strengthens the link between experience and memory when the body signals significance. So studies in educational contexts show that when learners experience emotion linked to material, retention improves compared to neutral presentations. That's because the emotional signal increases the likelihood that our hippocampus will stamp the event worthy of long-term storage. Now, think of the animated film Inside Out. On the surface, it's a movie about cartoon emotions living in a child's head, but surprisingly, it aligns very well with current affective neuroscience. What Inside Out illustrated so well is that emotional experiences shape which memories become core and which ones fade. The islands of personality in the film represent clusters of emotionally consolidated autobiographical memories. I know these sentences are long, but stay with me. Students remember emotionally charged moments. That can be laughter, embarrassment, surprise, wonder. All of these things are encoded more vividly than sterile instruction. So that's not a subjective preference. That's how the amygdala hippocampal axis works. Emotion also interacts with attention. Attentional networks are sensitive to affective salience. The brain prioritizes emotional relevant stimuli in selection and in orientation. More importantly for education, emotion influences encoding strategies. Under positive emotional states, learners are more likely to engage in deep elaborative processing, which means that they can relate new information to existing knowledge, evaluate its meaning, and integrate it more robustly into memory networks. We're going back to the schema here. That's what that is. And under stress or negative affect, cognition narrows and the brain defaults to threat avoidance rather than exploration. There is a sweet spot, however, when it comes to arousal, moderated memory enhancement. So very low affective engagement fails to tag memory, and very high stress can impair the function of our hippocampus. And all of these things lead to fragmented encoding. That's why traumatic memories are often vivid, but also fragmented, and why mild surprise or amusement can be more effective for learning than fear or pressure alone. In classroom design, this means emotion is a signal that determines what gets consolidated. Now, let's connect this back to storytelling. Stories create situations and not facts, and humor creates prediction violations, and emotion amplifies the signal. And altogether, they form a very potent encoding pathway. When a student experiences narrative with clear cause and effect, sprinkled with unexpected twists and emotional relevance, several different systems engage. The hippocampus organizes sequence and context. The prefrontal cortex evaluates meaning and consequences. The salience network flags relevance, the amygdala modulates consolidation, and dopamine signals learning potential. And all of these things contribute to a stronger, more retrievable memory trace. Going back to the needle in the haystack attached to the fishing line, the goal is to create a longer fishing line that is entwined through all the bales of hay, so you don't have to go scavenging for just the needle, you just have to search long enough to hit the fishing line. And that could be very far away from the needle, but it will get you there if you only find the line. So when I say that emotion tags memory, I do mean it literally. Emotional salience increases the probability that an experience will be retained and then later accessible. And this mechanism explains why we forget definitions, but we remember the stories that contained it, or why a concept linked to laughter or surprise stays with us longer than ones presented flatly. Whew. Okay, now we will finish this episode by tying all of this together while I make my case that jokes and meaningful narratives are not distractions from content, but necessary tools to make learning stick. Conclusion. Jokes teach better than explanations. If attention is limited, structure matters. If prediction drives engagement, violations matter. If emotion modulates consolidation, feelings matter. So by now the pattern is quite clear. The brain encodes experience and not instruction. So when we rely on instruction alone, we ask students to perform some heavy cognitive lifting, hold abstract symbols in working memory, infer relationships, impose their own structure, and generate personal relevance, all before anything has been emotionally tagged as worth keeping. Stories reduce that burden. It organizes information into a temporal sequence, it aligns with the hippocampal relational binding, and exploits predictive processing systems that are constantly modeling what comes next. Humor sharpens that signal. It introduces manageable prediction errors, activates reward circuitry, and increases dopamine-linked learning signals. It creates micro disruptions that forces the models to update without triggering a threat. And emotion seals the deal. Through the modulation of the hippocampus through the amygdala, emotionally salient material is stored because it is meaningful. So when I say that jokes teach better than explanations, I am not arguing for gimmicks. I am arguing for alignment. A joke tied to content is a precision tool. It collapses the expectation of the learners, it forces reinterpretation, and attaches affective weight to a concept. And that combination of structure, violation, and emotion creates durable encoding, which is what we want, because an explanation might be understood in the moment, but a story that makes you laugh, reconsider, or feel something is reconstructed, and reconstruction is the mechanism of learning. Even Inside Out understood this intuitively. Core memories are not neural facts. They were emotionally charged events that shaped Riley was her name, shaped her identity. Autobiographical memory research shows that emotionally significant episodes disproportionately influence our self-concept and long-term recall. That can either be really good or really bad, but it makes sense from an evolution standpoint. I'm losing it. Keep going. Simply put, emotion organizes narrative identity, and our students are no different. That happens for them too. They will not remember every single slide, but they will remember the moments that something clicked. They will remember the moments where the entire class laughed together. They will remember when a concept reframed how they saw the world. Saying the phrase, they will remember when the whole class laughed together, okay, I'm gonna take you back. I was in grade 9 and we were about to do our provincial achievement tests, and this was the era where cell phones were becoming a lot more popular, and there was a girl in my class who had a bump it. Do you know what a bump it is? It was a thing that you would put like on your head, and then you would style your hair over top of it to give you more volume. The late 2000s were their own time, but homegirl had a bump it in. This girl also did not have a cell phone to hand in at the beginning of the test. And the proctor of the exam was walking around, and he looked at that girl and said, "What, you don't have a cell phone to hand in? Are you sure you still don't have it?" And somebody called out, "It's in her hair!" The entire class erupted in laughter. It was hilarious. And that was the day I learned what a bump it was. See? All of those years ago, I didn't need to know what a bump it was. I've never worn a bump it, but it was emotionally relevant because it was hilarious. Not because it was louder, but because it was structured, disrupted, and tagged as hilarious. Haven't thought about that in a good minute. And it's not all about entertainment, although a lot of it can be seen through that lens. It is really about respecting the architecture of the human brain. Our brains are not optimized for the passive intake of information. It's optimized to construct meaning out of what we see around us. So the work here is not to demand attention, it is to design for attention. Give the mind a sequence, give it something unexpected, and give it something to care about. And memory will do what it has evolved to do. That's the neuroscience. That's the leverage. That's this whole episode. And that's how you teach to brains that have evolved for storytelling. Thanks for getting to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to catch the next episodes that are coming out of this series, Weird Pedagogy, here on YouTube. Listen to these episodes on Spotify. You can follow DTalk on Instagram and TikTok. The more neuroscience that I learn, the more I realize how exploitative platforms like Instagram and TikTok are. I'm sure YouTube is the same, but I'm not seeing those parallels. I'm rambling now. I've been filming for a while, so thanks again for getting here, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye. Actually, no, you made it to the end here, so I'll give you a little treat. I don't know if you've been able to see the sweater that I'm wearing. Let me pan down here for a second so you can see. My sweater here says, "No gods, only fluoride." Back when I was a teacher in a really small town, people were really convinced that fluoride, was going to make all the frogs gay.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
I don't know if you know that reference, but people were really up in arms with fluoride in the water. And one of my colleagues made a joke and said, "They don't need fluoride here. They have Jesus." And then the joke was, you don't need fluoride because you have God. You believe in God, so you don't need science. You don't need fluoride. God will save us from cavities, deliver us from tooth decay. And the story of that joke manifested itself into that of a sweater, which I wear regularly because I don't forget it, because it was a story. Ugh, God. Okay. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.